Hey, welcome everyone. Thank you again so much for attending our briefing on the 2023 Colorado Health Foundation Pulse Poll findings on housing and cost of living crisis, a troubling view of Colorado's horizon. Just so you do know, this is a webinar. It will be recorded, and you will be muted and your camera will be off, but we still want to hear from you. So please make sure to use the chat to share any comments or questions you may be having. We will be collecting those, and then we will be addressing some of those questions at the end of today's webinar. Closed captioning is available. So in order to do that, just click on the CC icon in the Zoom toolbar and select Show Captions. And again, we are recording this, so we will be sending this recording out as well as all of the slides and additional resources at the end of the presentation later today. So thanks again so much for attending. We're looking forward to sharing all of this information with you. Dave, if you could move to the next slide. Just a little bit about the Colorado Health Foundation. So we are working every day to bring health and reach for all Coloradans. And the way that we do that is by engaging closely with communities across the state, and that's through grant making, through policy advocacy, and through research, which is what we'll be talking about today. And our vision is that across Colorado, we can all say that we have all we need to live healthy lives. Next slide, please. So a lot of folks ask, what is Pulse? Why does the Colorado Health Foundation want to conduct public opinion research? So Pulse is an annual poll that we conduct. This is the 4th year that we've done Pulse. We started it in 2020. And really it gives us some quantitative data that guides our funding, our priorities, and it helps us see kind of what gaps exist. But really it's about listening, getting outside of our own circles and gaining an understanding about how everyday Coloradans are navigating today's challenges. At the foundation, we are, one of our cornerstones is that we serve Coloradans with less power, privilege, or income, and we prioritize Coloradans of color. So in doing that, we oversample certain racial and ethnic groups, including African Americans and Asian Americans, as well as Native Americans. And this is really so that we can explore the issues that are facing these communities and impacting their health and well-being, as well as it gives us an opportunity to analyze every single question by race or ethnicity. And we make all of this publicly available to reporters, policymakers, advocates, anybody who's working in these issue areas. And I would be remiss to not mention our partners who help us oversample Native Americans. Considering it's such a small population of Colorado, oftentimes it's hard for us to get good data on these communities. So in addition to our random sampling, we also conduct a convenience sample. And these are just a few of the partners that we've been working with this year to help us gain more information about these communities. And with that, I want to pass it on to our research team. We are working with Dave Metz from FM3 Research and Lori Weigel from Newbridge Strategies. And I just want to pass it on to them. So go ahead and kick it off, Dave.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much, Austin. Hello, everybody, and it's good to have you all here. I'm very excited to share the results of our 4th annual Pulse survey. I'm Dave Metz. I'm half of the polling team. I work with FM3 Research, and I'm joined by my colleague Lori Weigel from Newbridge Strategy. The reason there's 2 of us today is we represent a bipartisan partnership When my firm polls in political races, we poll only for Democrats. Conversely, Lori's firm, when she polls in political races, polls only for Republicans. But the two of us have been working together as a bipartisan team for a couple of decades now, doing research on a wide range of public policy issues to make sure that it is both designed and analyzed from a bipartisan perspective. We've tried to bring that perspective to Pulse over the course of the 4 years that we've been conducting the survey. The data you're going to see today is very comprehensive. It represents interviews with over 2,600 adult Coloradans across the state. And as Austin just explained, that includes oversamples of Black, Native American, Asian American Coloradans, as well as residents of Pueblo County, to make sure that we have enough interviews with those subgroups to break them out and analyze them comparatively with the rest of the population. All the data has been statistically weighted to ensure that the numbers you're looking at represent the demographic profile of all Coloradan adults based on census data. The overall results have a margin of error of plus or minus 2.2%. You'll see a number of places in the data where we break out the responses of individual subgroups of the population. And in those cases, the margin of error will be a bit higher. The interviews were conducted using a variety of different survey modes. As many of you probably experience in your day-to-day lives with your friends and family, everyone has different ways of communicating. There's some people who will talk on the phone. There's some people who like to send text messages, other people who send emails. For that reason, to ensure that we're getting the most diverse and representative sample of Coloradans throughout the history of Pulse, we've used a mixed mode approach. We draw a random sample of residential households statewide and match that set of addresses to a variety of databases to get contact information, including landline phone numbers, wireless phone numbers, and email addresses. We then invite people to participate in the survey with email outreach and text message outreach, follow that up with phone calls on both landline and wireless phones, and send postcards to sampled addresses for which we have no other contact information with a URL so that people can take the survey online. In addition to working with the partner organizations, as Austin described, to do outreach to some of the groups that we oversample. Through that methodology, we're able to reach the broadest and most diverse set of Coloradans and end up with a set of data that looks like the state. One of the great virtues of the survey is that it has now been conducted for 4 consecutive years. And so you're going to see a lot of places in the data where we track the evolution in public opinion over time. And there's a lot of fascinating findings, I think, not just about what Coloradans think today, but about how their opinions have been shifting or remaining consistent over the course of what has been a pretty turbulent 4 years, both in Colorado and around the country. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Lori to talk a little bit about the big picture and the issues that tell us are most on their minds today.
Great. And just to reinforce, this is a representative sample of all Colorado adults. So yes, proportionally, there are more unaffiliated within this sample. So it's represented by gender, by age, by, again, all those variables that we look at in order to ensure that we really are speaking to all Coloradans and representing their voices within this survey. So we asked a broad question, one of my favorite questions, because it really tells you what's most top of mind for Coloradans today, and asked them to tell us what's the most important issue facing the state right now. I don't think anyone of us that lives here in Colorado will be shocked by these responses that cost of living, cost of housing, and housing affordability really dominated the top most volunteered responses. Not far behind that, though, we heard a little bit about just how government functions, about politics today, the divisiveness that we see sometimes. And then a couple of other issues that, again, the new mayor of Denver addressed prominently yesterday was homelessness, but also public safety and crime. We're still in the mix in terms of people's responses. So lots of different issues, as you can see, many, the rest really in the single digits, but not that any of these are unimportant, but just less likely to be volunteered. It's important to note that we've asked this question over the years, and on the next slide, on this one, you can see that Just in the past year, we've seen a lot of stability in terms of those responses, that we're not seeing huge variations, although again, with the amount of rain that we had, some of the environmental concerns about water and fire and those issues dropped just a little bit more than anything else. But really, this is a lot of the things we've been hearing about in terms of what's most top of mind for Coloradans over the last few years. Most of these issues relatively within the margin of error from what we've seen in the last year, but a gradual uptick in those volunteering homelessness since our inception in 2020, for example. And then predictably, the most biggest decline has been for concerns about COVID-19. That went from a quarter in the most volunteered response in 2020, and virtually no one was volunteering that issue today. So lots of change and sort of unusual circumstances when we started this survey. And now we're really, many Coloradans really focused on those top 4 that I mentioned before. We then followed that up by looking at a number of these issues and asking people to tell us for each one, how would they rate them? Would they tell us it's an extremely serious problem, very serious, somewhat serious, or not too serious a problem here in the state? So again, not what's most top of mind, but asking them to rate each of these. You can see here that, again, those cost issues really kind of dominating the top tier. Rising cost of living and cost of housing were some of the most frequently cited as being an extremely or very serious problem. In fact, we have a majority saying that's an extremely serious problem here in the state. Homelessness, 4 in 5 telling us that's an extremely or very serious problem. And the cost of healthcare, which we're going to see in a second, has been relatively stable, but still it's 2/3 telling us that's an extremely very serious problem. Jobs in the economy, people are more mixed. Granted, the vast majority telling us it's at least somewhat serious, but only half saying that that's an extremely or very serious problem today. Now, notably, over the course of the last 4 years, we've seen a gradual uptick. 2/3 named homelessness as an extremely or very serious problem. We're up to 4 in 5 Coloradans now talking about that as an extremely very serious problem. And in fact, just in the last year, that's moved up 7 points. Again, I mentioned the relative stability. Cost of healthcare has been something that people have long been concerned with, not just during this time of talking to people through the Pulse poll, but over the course of our career, sort of a consistent theme. And then those concerns about jobs in the economy that really peaked in 2020 has tapered off a little bit and been relatively stable over the last year. But it's these latter 2 where we've seen, again, some moderation, but that starting in 2020 and moving up gradually the last couple of years, as we moved out of the pandemic times, we've seen people being more and more focused on that. And really, those are almost within the margin of error of what we saw last year. So no sort of grand decline in terms of people focusing on those particular issues. I'd be remiss if we didn't point out that obviously some of these issues are more likely to affect people based on their household income. And on the next slide, you can see that those that are most acutely concerned and most likely to tell us that the cost of living and cost of housing is an extremely or very serious problem. Definitely those on the lower end of the income scale. But what's striking is that we even have 3/4 of those in the upper tier of household income that we looked at that are telling us, yeah, that's a big problem here in the state. Cost of housing, same thing. So it's not as if this is sort of a tale of haves and have-nots entirely. Adults throughout Colorado are really telling us that these are big problems facing the state, irrespective of their particular financial status. So let's look at the cost of living in a little more detail. In fact, we did ask people about their personal situation and asked them to tell us which of these best sort of represents them. Are they living comfortably with increasing savings? That's about 1 in 4 Coloradans today. Are they living comfortably but not able to save so much? And that's about 1 in 3. And then we've got a significant proportion that are telling us they're either just getting by or really struggling financially. In fact, that's about 2 in 5 that fall into those latter 2 categories. So definitely some concerns there. And if you look at that, again, based on household income or whether they own their own home or renting, we see some pretty dramatic distinctions here. So those that are on sort of the lower end of the income scales here and those bottom 2 categories, far more likely to tell us that they're either just getting by or really struggling. And we can see that it's a majority of renters that also place themselves in those latter 2 categories of just getting by and really struggling. So some real distinctions in terms of their definition of their own financial situation right now. On the next slide, we also asked them to tell us relatively, would they say they are better off, worse off, or is their financial situation about the same as a year ago? And again, a question that we've asked all 4 years in this survey to really look at, and you can see that was people were pretty divided in 2020 and 2021 in terms of being better or worse off. They have been sort of more likely to be in that worse off camp the last 2 years. So again, about the same as last year, but a dramatic departure from what we heard the first 2 years of conducting this survey, that Coloradans are twice as likely to tell us that they're worse off than say that they're better off in their own financial situation. And again, it's about just over 1 in 3. They're telling us it's about the same as the year before. If we move forward to the next slide, we're saying that most Coloradans are not terribly worried about being unemployed in the last year, but it is 1 in 5, and it's about the same as what we heard last year, which was a big bump up from 2021. So 1 in 5 telling us they're worried. A majority, though, just a bare majority, though, saying that they're not worried when they're looking ahead to thinking about being unemployed in the next year. And then we asked them about some other concerns as well. How worried are they that they or someone in their household would be without health insurance coverage? Again, about the same response that we saw a year ago, but that's more than 1 in 3 that are saying they're either very or somewhat worried that they or someone else in their household could be without health insurance coverage in the next year. Even more dramatically, I think, is those that are worried about being able to afford enough food to feed themselves and their family. Really, when we've dug in other surveys in terms of rising cost of living, a lot of that is simply people go to the grocery store, they see the price of eggs going up, they see other things moving around, and some dramatic jumps sometimes in those costs. And we've got more than 1 in 3 Coloradans right now telling us that they are very or somewhat worried that they won't be able to afford enough food to feed themselves and their family. So again, very much in line with what we saw a year ago, but that was a big jump up from the first 2 years in terms of talking to Coloradans about these concerns. And they are coping in a number of different ways. You can see that more than 1 in 10 tell us they have skipped meals because they couldn't afford food. So 14% today, which is within margin of error of what we saw a year ago. But underneath that overall data, you can see that, again, household income plays a really big role in terms of people telling us that they're having to cope and skipping meals because they couldn't afford food. It's 2 in 5 in the lowest income bracket. There's about a quarter of those making $30,000 to $75,000 in household income every year. So again, a significant proportion telling us that they are having to find some coping. And again, communities of color in the state are more likely, especially those Native American indigenous populations, more likely to say they're having to skip meals because of not being able to afford food. So obviously some really acute concerns. So we wanted to test some different ways that Colorado may take action on these issues. And we looked at a number of different policies that could be put in place at the state level. Obviously, the Fed and others are trying to tame the rising cost of living nationally. But we wanted to look at some things that could be addressed in the state and ask people to tell us not whether they support or oppose that, but how effective they thought that each one of these would be in helping Coloradans make ends meet. So for each of these four, they were asked to tell us, is that something they think would be very effective, somewhat effective? Those are sort of the shades of blue there. Not too effective, or do they simply not know how effective that might be in terms of addressing and taming that rising cost of living in the state? So for those first two, either making it easier for lower income people to enroll in programs that can help them afford the cost of expenses like food and healthcare, we've got 3/4 saying that they think that would either be very or somewhat effective, and the greatest and some of the greatest intensity of those saying that would be very effective. Tax credits are also something for those who are living on lower incomes. 7 in 10 said that'd be very or somewhat effective. Specific government investments to stimulate the economy and create better paying jobs. We saw 2/3 telling us that's very or somewhat effective. And then we've got a bigger division, which I'll talk about in a second, on potentially sort of a wealth tax to cover some core services. Now, 2 of these we asked the year before, and you can see those here. And we've definitely seen an uptick in that idea of making government investments to create better paying jobs in communities that are struggling. That went up 9 points. The other one, the wealth tax, was really sort of relatively stable in terms of the response to that. But you can see, of course, the reason that we aren't waving magic wands and putting any of these things in place is really what you see on the next slide, which is the partisan response that we get. Again, we weren't telling people, asking people whether they support these, but simply how effective they think these might be. And on that, we get some distinctions by partisanship. You can see there's a 33-point gap when we even talk about making it easier for people to enroll in some of these programs. Tax credits is the least partisan response. We have, again, but for 3 of these, we're getting half or more Republicans indicating support. The biggest distinction is when we talk about increasing taxes. That's something that, as you all might have seen in polling on state issues, or even at the local level, when we're asking voters how they feel about a tax increase, typically we will see sort of a big distinction based on party, and that's a 54-point gap between Democrats and Republicans on that particular issue. Again, unaffiliated or independents in the states, more than 2/3 support every single one of these, or say that each one of these would be at least somewhat effective in addressing the rising cost of living. So, of course, housing is a big issue, and I'm going to pass to my colleague to talk a little bit more.
All right, fantastic. Thank you, Lori. So obviously the cost of living, as Lori has outlined, is a major concern for Coloradans this year. The cost of housing is a big part of that. And having seen that really be a sort of sharp and emerging issue in last year's survey, we included more questioning in this year's survey to try to understand some of the dynamics around Coloradans' attitudes toward housing, both their feelings about the cost of and availability of housing today, their perceptions of what will be effective in addressing some of the state's housing challenges, and then also how they feel looking forward, both about their own prospects and their children's prospects for finding an affordable place to live in the state. Our sample overall included about a little over 3 in 5 respondents who were homeowners, and then about 1/3 who were either renting or living with friends and family. Among the group who were renting, we wanted to understand a little bit more about the dynamics of how they're finding their housing. So we asked a question this year that we haven't asked in previous surveys to see where renters are getting their housing. Almost half say they get it from a large management company that owns multiple properties. Almost 1/3 say it's from a smaller sort of mom and pop style landlord who might own a small number of properties. And then about 1 in 5 are renting directly from a friend or family member. Lori went through some of the anxiety that Coloradans feel looking forward about whether they'll be able to maintain their health care or afford food, given the cost of living. Those concerns apply no less to housing than to those other sectors. And in fact, we see that more than a quarter of Coloradans tell us that they are worried that over the next year, they might lose their home because they can't afford the monthly rent or mortgage. That number is virtually identical to what we saw in last year's survey when it stood at 30%. And marks an increase from what we saw in the first 2 year surveys, where only about 1 in 5 Coloradans reported being worried about being able to afford their housing. So this is a concern that really emerged last year and has remained prominent in 2023. As was the case with a lot of the other economic anxieties that Lori outlined, this one also is not shared equally by all residents of the state. There is a significant difference in worry about being able to afford housing among communities of color in Colorado, with more than 2 in 5 Black, Hispanic, and Native American adults telling us that they are worried about losing their housing. Among white Coloradans, the equivalent figure is only 22%. So it is almost twice as high, in some cases more than twice as high, among those communities of color as it is among white Coloradans. Not surprisingly, renters also significantly more worried about losing their housing than are homeowners. In fact, almost half of renters, 49%, are worried that in the coming year they might not be able to afford their rent and might lose their current home. And the same concern is also prominent among those who are not currently employed. In fact, throughout the survey, we see a lot of commonality in the concerns about access to food, access to healthcare, and access to housing among those who have lower levels of household income or do not currently have employment. That income dynamic is also crystal clear when we look at this slide. The top set of rows on the table show, as we move from lower levels of household income up to higher, percentage of Coloradans that say that they are worried about losing their housing. And you'll remember there was a pretty significant gap when it came to healthcare or food, but it is a yawning gap when it comes to housing. 61%, more than 3 in 5 Coloradans with household incomes under $30,000 are worried about losing their housing during the coming year. Fewer than 1 in 10 Coloradans with incomes over $150,000 share the same worry, and it is a straight line correlation by income. So just a real sense of urgency and anxiety among lower income households about being able to retain their housing. And while there are some variations by region of the state, there is really no region that is immune to this concern. Roughly a quarter of Coloradans or more in each of the regions of the state tell us that they're worried about losing their housing during the coming year. Now, this concern is not a new one in Colorado. And as you'll see, as we looked at a few moments ago, over the course of the last 4 years, there have always been a sizable number of Coloradans who worry about being able to afford housing. The last 2 years, it has gone up significantly. That increase has not been evenly distributed across all of the income groups and racial and ethnic groups in the state, though, as you will see here. There has been a sharp uptick among Black Coloradans about concern about being able to afford their housing. Almost half of Black Coloradans right now saying that they're worried about losing their housing. That is up 16 points from where we saw it last year. It is up 19 points from where it was in 2021. So particularly acute concern among Black Coloradans. And as you'll see, the numbers, while they have trended up in all income groups, really does hit that peak among the lowest income Coloradans. So what impacts has this had on other aspects of people's lives as they try to afford what are steeply increasing housing costs in the state? We asked the respondents to tell us whether in the last year they had taken any of the steps that you see listed here in order to afford their rent or mortgage. Almost 1 in 3 Coloradans say that they have had to either work multiple jobs or work more than they wanted to in order to pay for housing. And just under 1 in 5 tell us they have moved because of housing costs or lived with a roommate, friend, or family member when they would rather not have in order to make housing more affordable. So you can see lots of ways, beyond just the sort of core need for shelter, that housing costs affect other aspects of the quality of life and sort of the way Coloradans are able to live their lives the way that they want to at a time of rising costs. And we also wanted to understand how Coloradans felt about these issues looking toward the future. And one of the things we've examined is for renters, how real do they think the dream of homeownership is in Colorado? Traditionally, renters typically aspire to own a home. And as you'll see here in Colorado, when we ask renters whether they would like to own a home someday, the vast majority of them say that they do. As you'll see on the left-hand side of the slide, 85% of renters say that they would like to own a home. But among that 85%, on the right-hand side, when we follow up and ask them how likely it is they think they will be able to purchase a home in Colorado, fewer than 2 in 5 think that their dream of homeownership will be realized in the state. And almost half, 47%, tell us that they think that they would like to own a home, but will be unable to do so in Colorado. So most Colorado renters who would like to own a home don't think they will be able to do it in the state. Now, for those who themselves are homeowners as well, and also parents, even if their housing situation is relatively stable, they also think about their children and the potential that their children will be able to grow up and stay in the same state where they live today here in Colorado. But most Colorado parents tell us they're very worried that their kids will not be able to do so. 54% of parents tell us they're very worried that their children will not be able to afford to live in Colorado. An additional 29% are somewhat worried, so more than 4 in 5 in total see this as a source of anxiety. And it cuts across pretty much every demographic and geographic subgroup within the state. Some slightly elevated numbers among white and Latino Coloradans, among those who live in the Eastern Plains or Larimer and Weld counties. But if you look at those income numbers, where I pointed out a moment ago, we saw that steep gap in the degree to which people were worried about being able to afford housing. In every single category, at least 3/4 of parents tell us they're worried that their kids won't be able to afford to live in Colorado, including that group with household incomes over $150,000. Only 7% of that group are worried that they won't be able to afford their housing in the next year, but 3/4 are worried that their kids won't be able to afford to live here. So when we think about public policy and sort of solutions to take on housing challenges, it isn't just where we are today that's on the public's mind, but also thinking about where they or their families would like to be in the future. And so in that context, we tested a range of policy ideas similar to the ones that Lori just walked through regarding the cost of living. Again, the scale we used here was not whether people supported or opposed these ideas, but whether they thought that they would be effective in addressing rising housing costs in Colorado. So there were a total of 7 different policies that we tested here. At least 2/3 of respondents rated each one an effective solution to addressing the housing challenges. And I think that just speaks to the urgency that the public sees behind this issue and their desire to see something done that they think will address what they think is a very acute problem right now. There are 2 policy solutions that stand out based on the proportion who believe they will be very effective solutions for addressing housing costs. And those are the 2 that you see at the top of the slide. Reducing property taxes for homeowners with low or fixed incomes so that they can afford to stay in their home, and then ensuring that landlords cannot raise rents on current tenants too quickly. So some form of cost controls, either for rents or for taxes, are broadly popular ideas right out of the gate. But you will see that there's also some recognition that there are basic supply and demand challenges here. Providing enough housing to meet an increasing demand in the state has an effect on prices. And so the notion of changing zoning laws to make it easier to build more housing close to job and transportation hubs is seen as very effective by 36% of those polled, with more than 2/3 overall rating it as effective. And then a variety of other ways that might incent the development of housing, especially housing that is affordable for lower middle income people, like requiring developers to build affordable housing, increasing direct public investment in it. And then, as you see, even at the bottom of the slide, the notion of making it more difficult to evict tenants who have not violated the terms of their lease. 2/3 also think that would be an effective solution. So the public is really embracing a whole lot of different tools that they hope might address something that they frankly see as sort of a crisis level concern right now. Now, as was the case with some of the policy solutions on the cost of living that Lori looked at, we also do see big partisan gaps in the perceived effectiveness of these approaches on a number of issues. But what that really determines is the breadth of support, and in most cases, not the absolute or the breadth of the sort of degree of confidence in their effectiveness, not necessarily whether the sort of core perception of whether it's an effective solution. Democrats embrace every single idea presented here, with more than 3/4 indicating they think that they will be effective solutions. For independents, slightly less broad, but still overwhelming majorities for every item, more than 2/3. And for Republicans, majorities rate all but 2 of these potential policy solutions as effective ways to address housing costs. The 2 that fall just short of majorities among Republicans are requiring developers to build housing for people with lower income levels and then increasing public investments. And as was the case with other policy items that we tested in the poll, including those that Lori looked at, increasing government spending on any subject tends to be a place where we see bigger divisions between the parties. But I think it's telling that on a subject like housing, those differences are sort of mitigated a little bit. And we've got almost half of Republicans saying, yes, increased government investment would be an effective way to address this issue. Not surprisingly, we saw the huge gap in concern earlier about the chance that they might lose their home over the course of the next year between renters and homeowners. And what that means is that renters are a little bit more eager to embrace or endorse the effectiveness of most of these housing policy proposals than are homeowners. Renters rated each of these as more effective than homeowners did. In most cases, the gap is double digits. Not surprising that renters are a little bit more enthusiastic, but again, even among those who own their own homes, we have at least 3 in 5 thinking each of these approaches offers a potentially effective solution to the state's housing needs. So I know that is a lot of data on some pretty thorny issues to cover in a short period of time. But I think now we will turn to take any questions you all have about what we see in the polling, and I'll hand it back to Austin.
Thanks, Dave and Lori. I really appreciate all y'all's work on this. Again, this is only our first release of all of the data that Pulse has to offer. But I do want to address some of the questions that have been asked in the chat. Again, please feel free to put any more questions in the chat now. Our first question, though, is, do we have any data on the average percent change in cost of housing between 2020 and 2023? Dave, please feel free to jump in on this. We do not have any data directly from the Pulse poll on this information, but we do know from other data sources out there that the cost of housing has continued to increase, and that there is some leveling out currently, but folks are definitely still concerned about the rising cost of housing from what you can tell in the Pulse poll. Our next question is regarding insurance on slide 17. Was there any follow-up questions on the reasons or rationale on why folks think that they may be without health insurance?
Unfortunately, there was not. Due to time constraints in the survey, we weren't able to ask follow-up questions to understand why people think what they think for a number of these questions. It would be fascinating if we could do that for everything in the survey. I will say, though, there are a number of data points in the surveys which give us some hints as to the factors that might lead people to feel this way. First is the percentage of people who are concerned about losing their job. That's about a quarter of the population that said they might be having to go without employment in the coming year. And obviously that could affect their health insurance. And we also see in a number of other questions in the poll, which will be part of the next phase release, we'll talk more about healthcare there, including mental health. there are concerns about access as well, and the degree to which either insurance coverage or providers who accept it are available in one's region and in a convenient way. So I think there's a couple of data points that help us understand some of the factors that might underlie this, but unfortunately not a direct answer to that question from the poll.
Dave, we also got a few questions about just, how we can potentially break up all of this data. There was questions about breaking up the data rural versus urban. Can you just talk a little bit more about how we are able to slice and dice all of this information?
Absolutely. And that's, I think, one of the fantastic benefits of the Pulse poll and the way that the Colorado Health Foundation is making the data available. For this year's survey and for all of the past surveys, you can go to the Colorado Pulse website and find not just the presentations that we're sharing with you today, and not just what we call the top line data, which is the overall percentage of respondents who offered one response or another to the survey's questions, but detailed demographic, geographic, partisan, attitudinal breakouts for every single question in the poll. The demographic data that Lori and I shared today is only a small fraction of the amount of data that's available. And so for all of the different potential breakouts you raised, and sort of urban versus rural, all the income and race and partisanship and everything else that Lori and I talked about today, every single question in the poll has those breakouts and many, many more. So we encourage you to look at the website where you can see that data. And Austin, you could potentially also talk about the tools that are available for people to sort of look at questions and design ways of framing the data for themselves and sort of self-generate some reports on these subjects.
Yeah, that is a great point. Starting in August, when we get prepared to release all of the data, folks will have a chance to use our interactive dashboard, which is available on the website, which instead of going through hundreds and hundreds of spreadsheets to look at the crosstabs, you're able to really slice and dice the data yourself and see the differences in perspectives and concerns based on all of those demographic questions. So that's going to be available later in August. Shifting over to another question, we have one. Do you get any sense of why certain economic concerns are higher, even at a time when there are historic levels of employment in Colorado? Do concerns of rising costs trump job security?
Yeah, I think clearly we're seeing that these concerns about the cost of living and very specifically the cost of housing, although not exclusively so, because we saw the cost of health insurance and other issues being a concern. That's just sort of the dominant conversation. I mean, we've definitely I've seen people in focus groups that I conduct that know exactly how much their assessed value of their property went up in the last that we all just got a couple months ago. So, I mean, I definitely think that is just some of the conversation that Coloradans are having with neighbors and friends. And, it just seems to be very dominant in terms of people's concerns. Right now, it's definitely trumping job security.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, like Lori, we do a lot of focus group research, both in Colorado and around the country. And when we have conversations about the economy, what we don't hear people saying very much is we need more jobs or there aren't enough jobs. There's a perception that anybody who wants work can find a job. There's lots of employers that are desperately seeking to hire people. But what we hear people say is what we need are good jobs. We need jobs that won't just hire us, but will pay us enough that we can afford the dramatically increasing costs of food and healthcare and housing. And we've also had people say we want jobs that make it possible not just to get by. Lori went through those numbers of people who feel like they're sort of just paying their bills versus struggling, but actually pay enough that you can set aside some money, you can save, you can plan for the future and have some prospect to be able to achieve those goals, like owning a home that for many Coloradans, they feel like are becoming less and less realistic goals for them. Jobs with benefits. So that's sort of how that discrepancy lines up. People look at the macroeconomic figures and say, sure, the economy as a whole is doing well. But is it providing me and my family with the resources we need in exchange for the work we provide that makes us feel comfortable that we can afford to live here and live the kind of life that we think anyone should be able to look forward to?
Another question that we received was kind of asked in reference to the racial and ethnic breakdowns of people worried about losing their housing in the next year, and just how that's affecting Coloradans of color.
Yeah, I mean, these gaps are absolutely staggering in terms of the degree of worry that Black, Latino, and Native American Coloradans tell us that they're feeling compared to what white or Asian and Pacific Islander Coloradans are feeling. And, you know, I think there's lots of other objective data to show that when it comes to the housing market, there are enormous racial disparities in all kinds of aspects of the way that housing is made available. So this really is, I think, a pretty stark sign of the disparate impacts that the housing market is having on different segments of the community, not just on a socioeconomic basis, but also on a racial and ethnic basis.
We also got some questions from folks asking if they're able to share this information out, if they have additional follow-up questions, things like that. And I will just say that absolutely, all of this data is completely available to the public. And even all of the slides that we shared during this presentation are not even close to the amount of information that we have, particularly on issues of the cost of housing or living. So I would strongly suggest that you go to the Colorado Pulse website, go to the results tab, and there's plenty of resources there, along with a longer slide deck on information regarding these issues. And if you do have any questions or are looking for specific breakdowns of some of the data, please feel free to reach out to me or just info@copulsepoll.org. We'll put that information in the chat as well. And we're happy to get whatever we possibly can to you to answer those questions. Another question we got was, do you believe the eviction moratorium has changed the views on housing stability since exiting the pandemic?
So it's hard to say the degree to which sort of the awareness and perceptions of the impact of that existing moratorium have affected things. Certainly, it does not seem to have done anything to hamper or soften the concern that people have about housing costs. In fact, it's been in the last 2 years, 2022 and 23, where we've really seen the concern about housing costs take off, which was after that moratorium was initially put in place. And we still see that there is broad support, or at least a broadly shared perception of effectiveness of having limits on eviction in place, although it, in relative terms, ranks lower than the top tier items you'll see on this slide, which deal more with property taxes and just the cost of rent overall. So, you know, I think it'll be telling, and this is something obviously that future Pulse polls will be able to pick up on, you know, as we move out of an era in which some of those eviction limitations are in place. Do we start to see the numbers, you know, advance at an even more dramatic pace than what we've seen so far? Existing policy has not in any way seems dampened those concerns very much. They've continued to rise, but it's possible they could accelerate in the future. It'll be something that's interesting to take a look at.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to keep in mind is that, you know, we obviously we had to cover so much in the survey, which is amazing, but we could have simulated the pros and cons for any one of these particular policies. And potentially sometimes after people think about them for a while, they may feel somewhat differently than their initial response. So these are definitely initial responses. And as we all know, sometimes the devil can be in the details when any particular policy can be put in place. So something to keep in mind as we move forward and considering all the direction and how these might be implemented.
Thanks, Lori. Similar to that, we had a question about how the new landlord laws are affecting the rental housing. We do not have any information particular to how things have changed over the last, since a lot of policy has changed, particular since the last legislative session. But again, we will, because this is an annual survey, and we are able to address all of these questions or concerns on an annual basis. It is something that we will continue to think about in terms of how things are changing for Coloradans, if their concerns are being addressed or prioritized by local policymakers, whether that's state legislators, county commissioners, city councils, things like that. And one of the main reasons too why we conduct the Pulse poll is because that we want to be able to share all of this information with those policymakers so that they can have solid quantifiable information about some of the issues that they're working towards and some of the bills that they're working towards, or even ballot measures that advocates are pushing for.
And I'll just preempt a couple questions because obviously you're seeing here everything that we tested in terms of policies and the effectiveness, perceived effectiveness of those in addressing the rising housing costs. Obviously, there's so many more issues we could have talked about in terms of senior housing, in terms of lots and lots of other policies. So basically, no, you're seeing what we were able to jam into this survey as comprehensive as we try and be. There's obviously lots of other aspects. I will say in other work that we've done in the state that concerns about senior housing tend to be less acute as concerns about local workforce housing. And so that has been pretty consistent everywhere we've had the opportunity to test both of those in the same survey. So anyway, just wanted to flag that because it seems like we're getting lots of questions about what else we could possibly cover, and hopefully in the future we'll be able to dig even deeper into some of these.
Yeah, I will say one of the great challenges year over year is figuring out what exactly to ask. We do want to be able to track a lot of this information year over year. So there are some consistencies that we want to keep. But then we also do want to see, what's rising to the top for folks as well. And we also need to keep a survey that is, not an hour long on the phone or online. So it's always a great challenge for me, for the research team, and for everyone on the Pulse team to really figure out how to prioritize some of these issues. One of those examples, we did get a question about rental conditions, cost of applications, or environmental conditions. Unfortunately, we were not able to get into a lot of those issues this year. But again, it's something that we look forward every single year to figuring out what to prioritize in the poll. I am not seeing too many other questions coming through. So I think, Dave, if you want to change the slide to the end. So I just want to give a heads up for folks. Again, this is only the first release, and it was really focused on the cost of living and cost of housing. but we do have 2 more webinar briefings, one in August. It's going to be on August 22nd. That will be more broadly focused on the questions that were not just about cost of living or cost of housing. That's going to be presented in English, but we'll also have simultaneous interpretation available in Spanish. And then we're also going to do a deep dive with an emphasis on responses from Hispanic and Latino Coloradans. That will be presented in Spanish with live interpretation available in English, and that will be on September 18th. So we really hope that you will join us for those briefings as well. And again, like I said, in August, we will have an interactive data dashboard available for you all to jump in and play with the data yourselves. And then you will also feel free to reach out to myself or to anyone on the Pulse team with any questions. But we thank you again so much for attending, for being interested in this data. My contact information is on the screen there.